Before the world knew her as the pale, hypnotic, unforgettable Morticia Addams, Carolyn Jones was just a fragile girl from Amarillo, Texas, dreaming of a life far bigger than the one she had been given. She did not come into Hollywood as someone protected by power, money, or a famous family name. She came in with sharp cheekbones, hungry eyes, a strange kind of elegance, and a quiet determination that made people look twice. But behind that face, behind that voice, behind that cool and almost dangerous screen presence, there was always something else. A loneliness, a need to be chosen, a need to be loved not as an image, not as a character, not as the woman in black standing beside Gomez Addams, but as Carolyn herself. And that is what makes the story of Carolyn Jones so haunting. Because for decades, people watched her and thought they understood her. They saw the glamour. They saw the strange beauty. They saw the perfect stillness of Morticia, the woman who seemed impossible to hurt. But Carolyn Jones was never impossible to hurt. In fact, those who looked closely could see that pain had followed her long before fame ever arrived. She grew up during difficult years, with health problems as a child and a family life that did not always give her the security she wanted. Acting became more than a dream. It became escape. It became control. It became the one place where she could transform pain into power. When she arrived in Hollywood, she was not the typical soft blonde starlet the studios loved to sell. Carolyn had something sharper, something mysterious, something slightly dangerous. She could be glamorous, but never ordinary. She could be beautiful, but never predictable. That made her unforgettable, but it also made her hard to place. Hollywood loves women who fit neatly into boxes. Carolyn Jones never did. She worked hard. She took roles that were dramatic, strange, seductive, wounded, and sometimes dark. She proved she was not just another pretty face when her performance in The Bachelor Party brought her serious recognition. She could act. She could command attention. She could enter a scene and change the temperature of the room. But even as her career rose, her private life remained complicated. The applause could fill a theater, but it could not fill the quiet rooms she returned to when filming ended. Then came Aaron Spelling. To many people, Aaron Spelling would later become one of the most powerful men in television. But before all that empire, before the massive success, before the legendary producer status, there was a marriage between him and Carolyn Jones. On the surface, it looked like the perfect Hollywood pairing. She was the striking actress. He was the ambitious writer and producer. They were both chasing something bigger than themselves. Together, they seemed like they could build a life that would survive the madness of the industry. But Hollywood has a way of turning love into pressure. Carolyn and Aaron were married for years, and during that time her star continued to grow. Yet marriage inside Hollywood is rarely simple. Careers shift, ambitions expand. People change under the weight of fame. What begins as support can slowly become distance. What begins as passion can become two people living side by side while chasing different futures. And for Carolyn, whose heart seemed to carry old wounds, distance was never just distance. It was rejection. It was silence. It was another reminder that being admired was not the same as being truly held. Then came the role that would define her forever. When Carolyn Jones became Morticia Addams in the Addams Family, something strange happened. She disappeared so completely into the role that the world never fully let her leave it. Morticia was elegant, icy, loving, bizarre, and utterly iconic. She did not beg for attention. She did not chase approval. She stood still, and the room came to her. In many ways, Morticia became everything Carolyn may have wished she could be in real life. Untouchable, desired, calm, in control. The irony was painful. On screen, Morticia had one of the most devoted husbands in television history. Gomez adored her with theatrical, wild, almost ridiculous passion. He worshipped her every word. Every glance between them suggested a love so complete that nothing outside their strange mansion could ever threaten it. Viewers laughed. They smiled. They envied that bizarre but loyal marriage. But Carolyn Jones, the woman inside Morticia, was living a very different truth. After the cameras stopped, after the makeup came off, after the black gown was put away, Carolyn was not surrounded by that kind of devotion. She was still searching for a love that did not fade when the lights went down. She had fame, beauty, recognition, and one of the most iconic roles in television history. But those things did not protect her from heartbreak. They did not protect her from loneliness. They did not answer the question that seemed to follow her through every chapter of her life. Who truly loved Carolyn Jones when she was no longer performing? That question would become more painful as the years passed. Because fame can be cruel to actresses, especially women whose faces become tied to one legendary role. The public remembers the character, but forgets the person. They remember the costume, the voice, the silhouette, the famous scenes. But they forget the woman who aged, suffered, loved, lost, and kept trying to survive beyond the image they preferred. Carolyn continued to work. She continued to appear on screen. She continued to prove that she was more than Morticia. But the shadow of that role followed her everywhere. Some actors spend their whole lives searching for one unforgettable character. Carolyn found hers, and then had to live with the cost of being remembered almost only for that. And yet, the most heartbreaking part of her story was not the fame. It was not even the way Hollywood slowly shifted around her. It was what happened when life began stripping everything away. The beauty, the career momentum, the certainty of tomorrow, the illusion that there would always be more time. Because before Carolyn Jones died, the story of her heart took one final turn. And the man connected to that final chapter was not the one most people expected. The final chapter of Carolyn Jones's life did not begin with a grand Hollywood comeback, a glittering awards ceremony, or a room full of powerful people waiting to applaud her. It began much more quietly. It began with a woman who had already given the world one of television's most unforgettable faces, trying to keep working, trying to keep standing, and trying not to let illness become the only thing people saw when they looked at her. By then, Carolyn had already lived several lives inside one lifetime. She had been the ambitious young actress fighting for a place in Hollywood. She had been the serious performer who proved critics wrong. She had been the wife of Aaron Spelling, standing close to a man who would become one of the biggest names in television. She had been Morticia Addams, the woman in black who made darkness look graceful. She had been admired, photographed, imitated, remembered. But being remembered is not the same as being protected. And Carolyn knew that better than most. After the Addams family, she kept moving, but Hollywood had changed. The industry that once saw her as mysterious and magnetic began to see her through the narrow frame of a single role. It is a strange curse. The part that makes you immortal can also become the part that traps you. To millions of viewers, she would always be Morticia. But Carolyn was not a ghost in a black dress. She was a living woman with bills, fears, regrets, hopes, and a heart that had been bruised more times than the public ever understood. Her marriage to Aaron Spelling had ended. Later chapters of love came and went. There were new beginnings, promises, disappointments, and the kind of emotional exhaustion that does not always show on a famous face. Hollywood could report the marriages. It could print the names. It could notice who entered and left her life, but it could not measure what each ending took from her. That is why the question surrounding Carolyn Jones is not simply who she loved. The deeper question is, who stayed when there was nothing glamorous left to gain? Because love in Hollywood is easy to believe in when the cameras are flashing. It is easy when beauty is at its peak, when invitations arrive, when the room still turns its head. But the truest love often reveals itself much later, when the applause fades, when illness enters, when the future becomes frighteningly short. That was the painful stage on which Carolyn's final love story unfolded. In the early 1980s, Carolyn joined the cast of the television soap opera Capital. To casual viewers, it may have looked like just another role, another job, another screen appearance. But for Carolyn, it was something more. It was proof that she was still here, still acting, still capable of stepping into character even as her body was betraying her. She was not ready to disappear. She was not ready to be remembered only in reruns. She wanted to work. She wanted to remain useful. She wanted, perhaps, to feel that the story of Carolyn Jones was not yet finished. But behind the scenes, she was facing cancer. That truth changes the way we look at those final appearances. Every line delivered, every scene completed, every public moment carried a private weight. The audience saw a performer. The crew saw a professional. But those close enough to know the truth saw a woman using every bit of strength she had left to keep control of her own ending. And then there was Peter Bailey Britton. He was not the most famous name connected to Carolyn Jones. He was not the man most viewers would immediately think of when they looked back at her life. Aaron Spelling had the fame. Her screen husband Gomez Addams had the fantasy. The public had its own ideas about romance, about glamour, about who mattered most. But Peter belonged to the final and most vulnerable chapter. And sometimes, that is the chapter that tells the truth. Carolyn married Peter Bailey Britton shortly before her death. That single fact carries more emotion than any headline could easily explain. By that point, she was not entering marriage as a young starlet chasing a dream. She was not stepping into a union built around Hollywood ambition. She was a woman who knew time was no longer unlimited. She knew what illness had taken. She knew what the future might hold. And still, she chose love. That choice says something powerful. It suggests that even near the end, Carolyn did not want to be defined by fear. She did not want cancer to have the final word. She did not want her story to end as only a tragedy of fading fame and physical suffering. Marriage, at that stage of life, was not about public image. It was not about building an empire. It was not about becoming a Hollywood couple for the gossip columns. It was about companionship, presence, loyalty. The quiet human need to not face the dark alone. That is where the title of her story becomes so haunting. Before she died, Carolyn Jones finally revealed the love of her life. But perhaps the revelation was not a dramatic confession spoken into a microphone. Perhaps it was not some hidden diary opened after her death. Perhaps it was quieter than that. Perhaps the revelation was in the choice she made when there was no time left for pretending. She chose the person who was there. For a woman who had spent so much of her life being watched, judged, styled, cast, and remembered through other people's fantasies, That final choice feels deeply personal. It was not Morticia choosing Gomez beneath the theatrical glow of a perfect television marriage. It was Carolyn Jones, sick but still herself, choosing real human closeness over loneliness. And maybe that is why her story still hurts. Because the world gave Carolyn Jones immortality, but not always tenderness. It gave her fame, but not always peace. It gave her a character who would never age, never weaken, never disappear. But Carolyn herself had to face every ordinary human heartbreak behind the mask of an extraordinary woman. In the end, the mystery was never whether Carolyn Jones could be loved by the public. Of course she could. The public loved her image. They loved her elegance. They loved the strange magic she brought to the screen. The real mystery was whether someone could love Carolyn when the image was gone. And in that final chapter, the answer finally began to appear. By the time Carolyn Jones reached the final season of her life, she had already learned the cruel difference between being adored and being known. Adoration is loud. It follows you through cameras, magazines, fan letters, studio hallways, and reruns that never seem to end. But being known is quieter. It happens when someone sees the parts of you the public never sees. The fear behind the smile. The exhaustion under the makeup. The woman beneath the legend. For Carolyn, that difference mattered more than ever. The public had loved Morticia Addams because Morticia seemed complete. She never looked desperate. She never looked uncertain. She never appeared to need anything from anyone except the strange, devoted love of Gomez. She moved like a woman who had already won the game of life. Every glance was controlled. Every word was smooth. Every silence belonged to her. But Carolyn Jones was not living inside that certainty. Her real life had been marked by ambition, illness, heartbreak, reinvention, and the quiet ache of never fully being understood. That is the part fans rarely saw. They saw the icon. They did not always see the woman who kept trying to prove she was more than one role, more than one marriage, more than one unforgettable image. And perhaps that is why the question of her greatest love is so complicated. Was it Aaron Spelling, the man who stood beside her during some of the most important years of her career? Their marriage had history, ambition, and the strange electricity of two people building separate dreams under the same roof. But history is not always the same as destiny. Sometimes the person who witnesses your rise is not the person meant to hold your hand at the end. Was it the fantasy of Gomez Addams, the fictional husband whose adoration made audiences believe Morticia was the luckiest woman on television? That love was not real, of course, but it became powerful in the public imagination. Generations of viewers watched Gomez adore Morticia with such wild devotion that they projected that romance onto Carolyn herself. They wanted to believe she had that kind of love somewhere. They wanted the woman behind Morticia to be just as worshipped as the character. But life is rarely that poetic. The most important love in Carolyn's life may not have been the loudest. It may not have been the most famous. 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 It may not have been the one people expected. It may have been the one that arrived when the world had stopped looking so closely. The one that mattered not because it came with glamour, but because it came with presence. Peter Bailey Britton entered the public memory of Carolyn Jones almost entirely through her final chapter. That makes him easy to overlook. In a Hollywood story, people often focus on the biggest names, the most dramatic marriages, the most famous connections. But sometimes the person who matters most is not the one who dominates the headlines. Sometimes it is the person who remains when the headlines no longer care. And Carolyn's final marriage suggests something deeply human. It suggests that even after disappointments, even after broken promises, even after the kind of loneliness that fame cannot cure, she still believed in love enough to make one final commitment. That is not a small thing. To marry near the end of life is to make a statement against fear. It is to say that love still counts, even when time is short. It is to say that companionship still matters, even when the future has become uncertain. For a woman facing cancer, that choice was not casual. It was not decorative. It was not a Hollywood stunt. It was intimate, private, and brave. There is something devastating about imagining Carolyn in those final months. The world still remembered her as ageless Morticia, frozen in black and white, forever elegant, forever composed. But Carolyn herself was no longer frozen in time. She was sick. She was vulnerable. She was facing the one role no actor can rehearse for. And still, she kept working. Still, she kept appearing. Still, she held on to the identity that had carried her through so much of her life. Acting had always been her refuge. As a young girl, it gave her a way out. As a young woman, it gave her a way into rooms that might have otherwise ignored her. As a star, it gave her power. And near the end, it gave her continuity. It allowed her to say, without words, "I am still Carolyn Jones. I am still here." But love gave her something different. Work could remind her who she had been. Love could remind her she was not alone. That is why the final chapter of Carolyn Jones should not be treated only as a tragedy. Yes, it is heartbreaking. Yes, she died too young. Yes, the illness that took her came after a lifetime of struggle and reinvention. But there is also tenderness in the fact that she did not leave the world only as a faded star or a remembered character. She left as a woman who had made one last human choice: to be loved, to be accompanied, to let someone close when it would have been easier to close the door. And maybe that is what she finally revealed. Not a shocking confession, not a scandalous secret hidden from Hollywood, not a dramatic name whispered from a deathbed, but the truth that the love of her life was not necessarily the person who made the biggest mark on her public story. It was the love that met her at the most honest point of her existence, when there was no more need for performance, when beauty was no longer a bargaining chip, when fame could no longer protect her, when all that remained was the simple question every person faces in the end: who is beside me now? For Carolyn Jones, that answer gave her final story its quiet heartbreak. And it made people look back at her life differently. Because suddenly, the woman who played Morticia was no longer just a symbol of Gothic glamour. She became something far more fragile, far more real, and far more unforgettable. She became a woman who spent her life being admired by millions while searching for the one kind of love applause could never replace. What makes Carolyn Jones's story so powerful is that her final love did not erase the heartbreaks that came before it. It did not rewrite her past. It did not turn every lonely night into something beautiful. It did not make Hollywood kinder to her or make illness less cruel. But it did reveal something that fame had hidden for years. Carolyn was not simply a mysterious actress with a legendary face. She was a woman who wanted what so many people want, but rarely admit: to be loved without needing to perform. That desire followed her through every stage of her life. When she was young, she performed to escape. She performed to become someone stronger than the frightened girl she had once been. Hollywood gave her that chance, but Hollywood also taught her that love and attention are not the same thing. Attention can be taken. Attention can be earned. Attention can be controlled by lighting, makeup, timing, and the right role. But love is different. Love cannot be forced by beauty. It cannot be guaranteed by talent. It cannot be secured by applause. And Carolyn learned that lesson again and again. Her marriage to Aaron Spelling remains one of the most fascinating parts of her personal history, because it sits at the intersection of love, ambition, and Hollywood transformation. They were both climbing, both trying to become something, both living in an industry where success changes the people who touch it. For a time, they must have believed they were building the same future. But as the years passed, their paths separated. His power in television grew. Her image became tied forever to one unforgettable role. Their marriage ended, but the public memory of it remained. And yet, even that marriage could not answer the final question of her life. Who truly saw Carolyn when she was not useful to a dream? That is the question that gives her later years their emotional weight. Because after the peak of Morticia, Carolyn was still acting, still fighting, still searching for roles that allowed her to remain visible. But Hollywood has a short memory when it wants to. It worships a woman at one age and abandons her at another. It turns actresses into icons, then punishes them for not staying frozen in the form audiences remember. Carolyn's image as Morticia never aged. But Carolyn did. That contrast must have been painful. Somewhere, every day, someone was still watching her in black and white, still marveling at her elegance, still imagining her as untouched by time. But in real life, she was aging, changing, and eventually fighting a disease that did not care how famous she had been. Cancer did not care that millions loved her. It did not care that she had once turned a Gothic television mother into a cultural symbol. It did not care that audiences still saw her as immortal. Illness is the moment when glamour becomes useless. And that is where the final love story becomes impossible to ignore. Peter Bailey Britton was connected to Carolyn not at the height of her myth, but during the collapse of the illusion. That is what makes the relationship feel different from the others. It arrived when Carolyn had far less to hide behind. The costumes, the studio lights, the carefully shaped public image. None of those things mattered in the same way anymore. What mattered was presence. What mattered was whether someone could remain close when life became difficult to witness. For Carolyn, marrying Peter near the end of her life was more than a romantic decision. It was a declaration that she still belonged to life. Even with sickness closing in, she was not simply waiting for an ending. She was choosing connection. She was choosing tenderness. She was choosing to be someone's wife, not just someone's memory. There is a quiet dignity in that. Many stars spend their final years surrounded by the noise of their own legend. Old interviews, old photographs, old stories repeated by people who were never really there. But Carolyn's final chapter was not only about what the public remembered. It was about what she needed when the public could not help her. She did not need another fan letter to tell her she was unforgettable. She needed a human being beside her. That is why people continue to return to this story. Not because it is filled with scandal, but because it cuts deeper than scandal. It reminds us that the most famous women in the world can still feel unseen. It reminds us that beauty does not protect anyone from abandonment. It reminds us that a person can be adored by millions and still be waiting for one person to stay. Carolyn Jones spent much of her life being transformed by other people's expectations. Studios shaped her. Directors cast her. Viewers remembered her in one specific way. Even her most famous role turned her into an image so strong that it nearly swallowed the woman behind it. But in the last act of her life, when there was no longer much room for illusion, she made a choice that belonged only to her. She chose love in its simplest form. Not the fantasy love of Morticia and Gomez, not the ambitious Hollywood love tied to rising careers, not the kind of love that exists for magazine photographs and industry parties, but the kind of love that sits beside a hospital bed, the kind that hears difficult truths, the kind that does not look away when the body weakens, the kind that understands that a person is still a person, even when the world has stopped watching. And that is why the phrase, love of her life, becomes so complicated in Carolyn's story. It may not mean the longest marriage. It may not mean the most famous husband. It may not mean the person history expected. It may mean the person who met her at the most honest point of her life and accepted what remained. For Carolyn Jones, that may have been the greatest revelation of all. Because by then, she had already been admired as an actress, desired as a beauty, celebrated as an icon, and remembered as Morticia. But in those final days, what mattered was not whether she could still enchant an audience. What mattered was whether she could still be held as Carolyn. The more people looked back at Carolyn Jones, the more they began to realize that her life had always been split in two. There was the Carolyn the public consumed, and then there was the Carolyn very few people were allowed to reach. The public version was sharp, elegant, mysterious, almost unreal. She could stand still and make silence feel dangerous. She could turn one glance into a performance. She could make darkness look glamorous. But the private Carolyn was not made of shadows and silk. She was made of fears, disappointments, hope, and a kind of emotional hunger that success never fully satisfied. That is what makes her final love story so moving. It did not happen at the beginning, when everything was possible. It did not happen at the height of her fame, when the whole industry was still looking at her. It came when life had narrowed. It came when time had become precious. It came when the most important question was no longer, will they remember me? But who will remain beside me? For many years, Carolyn had carried the strange burden of being unforgettable in a role that was not fully her. Morticia Addams gave her immortality, but it also created a beautiful prison. The world adored Morticia because Morticia never appeared wounded. She did not chase love. She received it. She did not explain herself. She existed with total confidence. Her husband worshipped her. Her children needed her. Her strange household revolved around her quiet power. Carolyn gave the world that fantasy so perfectly that people forgot it was a fantasy. In real life, love was far less certain. Men came into her life, and some left deep marks. Marriage promised stability, but did not always deliver it. Fame promised fulfillment, but often created distance. Every public success seemed to come with a private cost. And as the years passed, Carolyn learned that being wanted by an audience could never replace being understood by one person. That may be why her final decision to marry Peter Bailey Britton feels so emotional. It was not about building a Hollywood dynasty. It was not about chasing publicity. It was not about making the world jealous. By then, Carolyn had already seen enough of fame to know its limits. She knew how quickly attention could turn into memory. She knew how quickly a woman could be celebrated, then reduced to a role she once played. She knew the world would always call her Morticia before it called her Carolyn. But Peter's place in her life belonged to Carolyn, not Morticia. That distinction matters. He was not marrying the immortal television image. He was marrying a woman facing the most frightening season of her life. A woman who was still proud, still talented, still determined, but also vulnerable in a way the public rarely saw. And for Carolyn, allowing that kind of closeness may have required more courage than any performance she ever gave. Because when you have spent a lifetime being looked at, being truly seen can feel terrifying. The final months of Carolyn Jones were not easy. They could not have been. Illness changes everything. It changes how a person moves through the world. It changes how the mirror feels. It changes how people behave around you. Some become tender. Some become awkward. Some disappear because pain makes them uncomfortable. That is one of the cruelest truths about suffering. It reveals who can stay near you when there is nothing pleasant about staying. In that sense, the end of Carolyn's life became a test that no award could measure. The world had applauded her talent. Critics had recognized her gifts. Viewers had turned her into a legend. But none of that mattered in the same way when she was confronting her own mortality. In those final months, what mattered was simpler and more brutal. Who would sit beside her? Who would listen? Who would still speak to her as a woman, not as a fading star? Who would remember that beneath the illness and the legend was a person who still wanted tenderness? And perhaps that is where Peter's importance becomes clearer. He represented a kind of love that does not need to be dramatic to be powerful. He did not need to be the most famous man in her life to become one of the most meaningful. He did not need to define her career to matter in her heart. His significance came from timing, loyalty, and presence. The things that sound small until life becomes hard. Then they become everything. Carolyn Jones had spent years making audiences believe in strange, theatrical love. As Morticia, she made viewers believe that devotion could be elegant, playful, and eternal. But in her own final chapter, love looked different. It looked quieter, less performative, less perfect, more human. There were no elaborate sets, no scripted lines, no carefully lit close-ups, no television husband kissing her arm while audiences laughed. There was only a woman nearing the end of her life and a man who became part of that ending. And that is why the story stays with people. Because it forces us to ask whether the greatest love of a person's life is always the most passionate, the longest, or the most famous. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes the greatest love is the one that arrives too late to change the whole story, but just in time to change the ending. Sometimes it cannot save a life, but it can soften the leaving. Sometimes it cannot defeat illness, but it can make sure someone does not face illness alone. For Carolyn, that may have been the final gift. The public would remember her as Morticia forever. It would freeze her in black gowns, long hair, pale skin, and that calm, hypnotic stare. It would replay her scenes and treat her as if she belonged to another world. But Peter's presence reminded us that Carolyn was not an icon carved in stone. She was a woman whose final wish was not to be worshipped by millions, but to be loved closely by one. And after all the glamour, all the heartbreak, all the roles, all the marriages, and all the years of being misunderstood, that quiet truth may be the most devastating part of all. Carolyn Jones did not need the world to finally understand Morticia. She needed someone to finally understand Carolyn. For years, Carolyn Jones had been remembered through images that were almost too perfect to feel human. The black dress, the long dark hair, the pale face, the calm, dangerous smile. Those images became part of television history, and because they were so powerful, they made it easy for people to forget that Carolyn's real life was not a Gothic fairy tale. It was not perfectly scripted. It did not come with a loyal Gomez waiting in every room. It did not protect her from divorce, fear, illness, or the slow loneliness that can follow a woman after the spotlight begins to move away. That is why her final chapter feels so different from the rest of her legend. It was not built around glamour. It was built around truth. By the time Carolyn became seriously ill, The public still had a version of her locked in memory. To them, she was still Morticia, still graceful, still untouched. Still the woman who seemed to float through a scene as if nothing ordinary could ever reach her. But illness is ordinary in the most brutal way. It reaches everyone. It strips away illusion. It does not care about beauty, applause, or the characters people once played. It takes the famous and the unknown through the same frightening doorway. And Carolyn had to face that doorway while the world continued to remember her as someone almost supernatural. That contrast is heartbreaking. Imagine being loved by millions for an image of control while privately losing control over your own body. Imagine being remembered as a woman who never trembled while quietly facing fear that no performance could hide. Imagine knowing that your most famous character would remain young and elegant forever, while you yourself were running out of time. This is where Carolyn's story becomes more than a Hollywood biography. It becomes a story about what remains when the costume is gone. And what remained was a woman still reaching for love. That is why Peter Bailey Britton's role in her final days carries so much emotional weight. He was not the beginning of her fame. He was not the architect of her career. He was not the man who made her a household name. He was not the fantasy husband viewers associated with her most iconic role. But he was there in a chapter when being there mattered more than being famous. In life, timing can make love unforgettable. Some people enter when the music is loud, when the party is full, when the cameras are flashing, and when loving someone famous feels like standing close to fire. Others enter when the party is almost over, when the lights are dim, when the applause has become an echo, and when love requires something deeper than fascination. Peter belonged to that second kind of story. His importance was not based on spectacle. It was based on presence. For Carolyn, presence may have been the thing she had needed most all along. Throughout her life, she had been admired for how she appeared. Directors saw her face. Producers saw her potential. Audiences saw her mystery. Men may have seen beauty, charm, or the excitement of being near a star. But to be seen in suffering is different. To be loved when you are not performing is different. To be chosen when you can no longer offer the illusion of endless youth and effortless glamour is different. That kind of love does not make noise. It simply stays. And perhaps that is why the story of Carolyn's final marriage feels like a revelation. It was as if, after all the roles and reinventions, the truth of her heart finally became visible. Not through a dramatic speech, not through a scandal, not through a lost confession, but through a decision. She married near the end because love still mattered to her, because companionship still mattered, because even after disappointments, she had not become too cold to want warmth. That alone says something about her spirit. It would have been easy for Carolyn to retreat into bitterness. She had reasons. Hollywood had boxed her in. Love had failed her more than once. Her body had betrayed her. The public had reduced her to a character. Time had not been gentle. Yet in the end, she did not choose isolation as her final statement. She chose connection. That choice gives her story a quiet kind of power. When people talk about legendary actresses, they often talk about beauty first, then fame, then roles, then scandal. But those things only tell the surface story. The deeper story is what a person still believes in after life has disappointed them. Carolyn Jones, for all her pain, still believed enough in love to step toward it one final time. And that is what separates her final chapter from the mythology around Morticia. Morticia was untouchable. Carolyn was not. Morticia lived in a world where love was theatrical and certain. Carolyn lived in a world where love could be temporary, complicated, and painfully human. Morticia never seemed afraid of loss. Carolyn had known loss intimately. But maybe that is exactly why Carolyn's real love story matters more than the fictional one. Because fictional devotion is easy. It can be written perfectly. It can be repeated in every episode. It can be preserved forever. Real devotion is harder. Real devotion has to survive sickness, exhaustion, uncertainty, and the helplessness of watching someone fade. Real devotion does not always get applause. Sometimes it happens in private rooms, in small gestures, in quiet conversations no one else will ever hear. That was the love Carolyn needed at the end. Not a love that made her more famous, a love that made her less alone. And in the final measure of a life that had been watched by millions, that may have been the most important thing of all. Carolyn Jones had already given the world an unforgettable woman in black. But before she died, her own life revealed something far more vulnerable. Behind the iconic stare was someone who had spent a lifetime wanting to be held not as a legend, but as a human being. And when that final chapter came, the answer to the mystery was not written in Hollywood lights. It was written in who stayed when the lights were almost gone. In the end, Carolyn Jones's story was never only about who she married or who held her hand in the final chapter. It was about the painful journey of a woman who spent her life trying to separate love from performance. From the beginning, she had learned that being impressive could open doors. Beauty could make people look. Talent could make them stay for a while. Mystery could make them remember. But none of those things guaranteed that someone would truly understand the person underneath. That was the ache hiding behind her legend. When audiences first fell under her spell, they saw a woman who seemed impossible to break. Carolyn had mastered the art of stillness. She did not need to overact to dominate a scene. She could simply appear, and suddenly everything around her felt sharper. That was rare. That was power. But it also helped create a misunderstanding. People assumed that because she looked controlled, she was not vulnerable. They assumed that because she played darkness so beautifully, she was not afraid of it. But the truth was more human than the image. Carolyn knew fear. She knew disappointment. She knew what it meant to begin again after something ended. She knew the strange humiliation of being publicly remembered for a character while privately fighting to remain a full person. She knew how fame could surround you without comforting you. She knew how people could praise the image and still miss the woman. And by her final years, she had nothing left to prove on that front. She had already earned her place in television history. She had already become immortal in the one way Hollywood can offer immortality. Her face would continue to appear long after she was gone. Her voice, her movements, her strange elegance would survive through reruns and memories. But immortality on screen is not the same as peace in life. That is where the tragedy deepens. Carolyn's body was failing at the same time her image was becoming permanent. The world would keep seeing her as Morticia, untouched and eternal, while she herself was experiencing the terrifying reality of illness. That is one of the cruelest contradictions of fame. The public owns a version of you that never changes, while you are forced to change in private. And in that private reality, Carolyn needed something fame could not give her. She needed love that did not depend on the image. That is why the final marriage matters so much. Whether people call Peter Bailey Britton the love of her life, the love of her final days, or the man who stood beside her when the curtain was closing. His role belongs to the emotional center of the story, because he represents the kind of love that arrives when illusion has lost its usefulness. He did not enter the story as part of the glamorous mythology. He entered it as part of the human truth. And the human truth was this: Carolyn Jones did not want to leave the world only as Morticia Addams. She wanted to leave as Carolyn, a woman who had loved, lost, suffered, chosen, and still reached for tenderness when life had every reason to make her close her heart. That is what makes her final decision so heartbreaking and beautiful. A person who has been hurt many times can become guarded. A person who has been reduced to an image can begin to hide inside that image. A person who has watched relationships fail can stop believing that love is worth the risk. But Carolyn did not do that completely. Even near the end, she allowed herself one more act of trust. She chose to belong to someone. Not to the industry, not to the audience, not to the memory of a role, but to a real human relationship in the most vulnerable period of her life. That is not a small ending. That is not a footnote. That is the kind of detail that changes how we understand everything before it. Because when we look back at Carolyn's career, we can see the performances. We can see the magazine photographs. We can see the strange beauty that made her unforgettable. But when we look at her final chapter, we see the thing she may have needed most all along. Not admiration, not fascination, not myth. Devotion. And devotion is not always dramatic. Sometimes it does not come with grand speeches or public declarations. Sometimes devotion is simply staying when leaving would be easier. It is answering fear with presence. It is seeing a person at their weakest and refusing to reduce them to that weakness. It is loving someone not because they are still glamorous, but because they are still themselves. For Carolyn, that distinction meant everything. Her story also says something about the way audiences treat stars. We often want them to remain symbols. We want them frozen at their most beautiful, most powerful, most watchable moment. We do not want to imagine the loneliness behind the image, because that would make the fantasy harder to enjoy. But Carolyn's life asks us to look past the fantasy. It asks us to remember that behind every iconic face is a person living a private life far more complicated than the role that made them famous. And perhaps that is the real reason her story still feels so haunting. Morticia Addams was loved in a way that looked perfect. Carolyn Jones was loved in ways that were imperfect, fragile, and deeply human. Morticia lived forever inside the safety of fiction. Carolyn had to face time, illness, heartbreak, and the final silence that comes for everyone. But before that silence arrived, she made one last choice that revealed what mattered most. She did not choose isolation. She chose love. And maybe that is the final truth hidden inside the title. Before she died, Carolyn Jones did not need to reveal the love of her life with a shocking confession. Her life revealed it through action, through the person she allowed into her final days, through the quiet courage of accepting companionship when the world could no longer offer rescue. The woman who once made darkness look elegant was, in the end, simply trying to find light. Not the artificial light of a set, not the flash of cameras, not the glow of fame, but the small, human light of someone staying close when everything else was fading.